Only days after taking command in 1775, George Washington decreed that no black, free or enslaved, could be recruited to fight. As a Virginian and slave owner, Washington made this decision mainly to appease Southerners who feared that arming blacks would lead to slave rebellions. And many white soldiers expressed disdain at the idea of fighting alongside men they considered to be nothing more than property. So a deal was struck. Those free blacks serving in northern regiments would be able to finish their terms of service. Then Washington would have an all-white army. But military realities soon forced a change in military policies. Ultimately, everything from a shortage of soldiers to the variety of colonial economies determined which side blacks would choose to fight for. The most important factor, however, was the promise of freedom. For both armies, the British and the American rebels, the need for men trumped most other calculations. In November 1775, the colonial governor of Virginia issued a decree that infuriated colonists. Quote, "I do hereby further declare all indented servants, Negroes and others, appertaining to rebels, free, that are able and willing to bear arms, they joining His Majesty's troops." For the British Army, the reasoning was twofold. Escaped slaves would bring economic hardship to their rebel masters and straighten the ranks of the British forces. For slaves, the promise of freedom drew tens of thousands to the British side. This decision, however, wasn't made because the British weren't racist. Blacks were generally barred from fighting, and most newly freed slaves, men and women, were assigned manual labor. They built fortifications in Savannah, Georgia, foraged neighboring towns for supplies, worked as cooks and servants for British officers, and they traveled the rivers of the South as boat pilots. Meanwhile, on the rebel side, the colony's inability to fill soldier quotas forced Washington in January 1777 to retract his decision barring free blacks. About a year later, enough slaves in Rhode Island, also promised freedom in exchange for service, enlisted to fill 2 battalions. Most northern colonies soon followed Rhode Island's decision to allow blacks to fight. A common practice at the time was for many runaway slaves to pass themselves off as free in order to serve in the rebel army. Often, especially in Virginia, slaves fought as substitutes for their masters. For South Carolina and Georgia, it was a different story. Even with increasing pressure from Congress for additional manpower, those colonies would not arm slaves. In fact, many South Carolina rebels pledged loyalty to King George III to keep their slaves. In the end, an estimated 5,000 African Americans picked up arms to fight for colonial independence, while many more worked as manual laborers. According to Adele Logan Alexander, research professor of history and American studies at George Washington University, quote, "They made a difference in terms of the size of the Continental Army. Washington, who was a brilliant general, understood that you could not have the disruptive impact of all those people going over to the British." Once the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783, which officially ended the American Revolutionary War, the fate of African Americans would vary. Many who fought for the crown fled with the British Army. Some headed to the Caribbean while others left for Nova Scotia, London, or a new colony in Sierra Leone. Some who remained began to petition local and state governments for equal rights. The American Revolution did help launch a movement that would eventually outlaw slavery in the North, but many decades would pass before the assertion that, quote, "all men are created equal" would be universally applied.